Hey, Cypher here. The Promise is an interesting case for history in film. This is historic fiction, but it is designed specifically to elicit awareness of the subject matter. In fact, it is somewhat humanitarian in that effort, and even more so in other ways. I have a fairly minor problem with it, but in terms of being an introduction to the Armenian genocide, the movie achieves that goal stupendously. The country of Armenia today is only half of the territory it was supposed to occupy. The other half is in Turkey. Back during the expansion of the Turkish Ottoman Empire in the 17th century, the Caucasus, including Armenia, was a contested area between them and Persia. As a result of those wars, Armenia was split between the two empires. Even though the Turks were an Islamic caliphate, they abided by the religion's pre-established rules governing non-Muslims, called dhimmi, and the Armenians, being Eastern Orthodox Christians, were dhimmi. They incurred more of a tax burden and had their own insular government called a patriarchy. This was the case for other Christians within the empire, including Greek Orthodox, Assyrians, and Bulgarians, along with other religions like Jews, Druze, and Yazidis. Because of this semi-tolerance, some historians have called the Ottoman Empire a multinational empire. The Ottomans maintained their expansion for another century, until it started being defeated by the Russian Empire. Russia even took control of eastern Armenia in the process of expansion. The Ottoman Empire began to experience increasing rebellions as a result of that stagnation, and they tried to reform to meet the new demands. It seemed like each reform was not enough. It culminated in the Tazimat period. They even instituted a constitutional monarchy for a couple of years, thanks to the Young Ottoman movement. Groups like the Armenians created their own national assemblies as part of these reforms. But the constitution was revoked and their movements were suppressed by force. Everything went underground, and by the 1880s, secretive nationalistic organizations were in full swing throughout the empire. Europe became increasingly aware of Ottoman suppressions of these revolts, calling it the Eastern Question or the Armenian Question in the press. They began to intervene in various ways, which also started to break up the Ottoman Empire even further. Following the end of the Russo-Turkish War in 1878, the Congress of Berlin was assembled to deal with the Eastern Question. This is what created the Balkan states. A mass population exchange began between Bulgaria and the Ottoman Empire. This was the breaking point for the empire. Other empires, especially Britain, began taking chunks out of the empire, like Egypt and Cyprus. Armenians and other Christian minorities in the empire, despite being represented in Berlin, did not have their problems solved. In fact, Sultan Abdul Hamid II did not comply with the reforms stipulated by the treaty, which led to several resistance organizations, including the Armenian Revolutionary Front, or ARF. The ARF began arming partisans called Fedai. A rebellion organized by the ARF in Sassoon turned into a major battle in 1894. The rebellion was quelled, ending in a massacre of 20,000 people, spawning further rebellions throughout the empire. Sultan Hamid ordered them to be quashed, and a systematic extermination campaign began, only ending in 1896, resulting in about 200 to 300,000 deaths, including many non-Armenian Christians. The massacres were only stopped by international attention making Hamid pull back. In 1904, there was another Sassoon rebellion, but it did not spread elsewhere. A year later, there was an ARF-backed assassination attempt on Sultan Hamid, where they bombed a mosque and killed 26 people, missing Hamid II in the process. In 1908, the Young Turks, not those ones, took control of the government and reinstituted the constitutional monarchy. The ARF, along with other minority organizations, was legalized and part of the new government. As a result of a counter-coup attempt, a year later, a massacre happened in Adana Vilayet that ended in between 20 and 30,000 dead Armenians and Assyrians. The main party was the Committee for Union and Progress, or CUP for short. This was the party of the Young Turks, not those ones. CUP took full control of the government in another coup d'etat in 1913, after another Young Turk, not those ones party, had seized power and started to push out CUP. With international intervention, Cup brought a reform package to the Armenians that would have given them a few autonomous provinces with European oversight. Unfortunately, the Armenian reform package was signed into law only a few months prior to World War I, and so was not implemented. World War I was an extension of the Balkan Wars, and those wars had already caused mass deportations to and from the Ottoman Empire, especially of Bulgarians and Greeks out of the empire and Turks into it. It was feared that this was a possibility with the Armenians during the war. That fear wasn't alleviated when Russian Armenians fought against Ottoman troops in the Caucasus. After a defeat there, the Cup leadership, later to be infamous as the Three Pashas, began to blame Armenians for Ottoman defeats. Enver Pasha forced Armenians in the army to disarm and become part of labor battalions. Beginning in April of 1915, armed resistance in Van by Armenians was prompted by an attempt to conscript them en masse. Some historians have said that this was done purposefully by Cup to give them an excuse to do what came next, but that is only conjecture. A week later, in what has become known as Red Sunday, around 250 Armenian intellectuals were arrested. That number would grow to above 2,300 over the next week.
It does appear to be an attempt to stifle and silence the Armenian population.
All of whom were either executed or sent to labor battalions. Cup passed the Tekir law that officially allowed them to resettle all Armenians throughout the empire. Then the mass deportations began, but this resettlement campaign belied a much worse program. These deportations were supplemented by massacres.
Minister, you are using this so-called relocation as a cover for the systematic extermination of the Armenian people.
While the forceful migration into concentration camps were basically death marches, the rounding up and killing of thousands took place as well. The concentration camps were so bad that hundreds of thousands of people died as a result of malnutrition. There were even groups created that were essentially extermination troops. The violence spread to non-Armenian Christians as well, like Assyrians and Greeks. It was an attempt at extermination of an entire ethnicity on an unprecedented scale. The systematic murder became somewhat inventive, with mass drownings, intentional drug overdosings, biological warfare, and gassing people in buildings. Neutral American reporters got word out.
Armenian men are being slaughtered in their villages. Their women and children are being driven into the desert to be murdered. Send that!
While German advisors secretly documented the atrocities for posterity, ambassadors and consuls did their best to help. As the Ottomans began to lose the war, foreign occupied territory helped refugees. The siege of Van, for instance, was only stopped by Russian troops coming through. The worst of it was in 1915, but the extermination attempt continued. After the war ended, Cup's extermination policy was somewhat curtailed. But rogue elements continued it. The Three Pashas, along with a bunch of other leadership, fled the country. In what has been called the Turkish court-martials, Cup was tried and abolished for the extermination policy, while the perpetrators were sentenced to execution. But since there was no international law to prosecute, the perpetrators were not arrested. So the ARF created Operation Nemesis, where they sought after these outlaws of civilization, as the US ambassador called them, and assassinated several of them. Eastern Armenia had formed a separate republic out of the former Russian Empire, and as part of the Paris Peace Conference proceedings, Woodrow Wilson was given free rein to create the borders of that country. Wilson! He drew the lines to include Western Armenia, which angered the newly formed Turkish government. So Turkey and Armenia immediately started fighting over the territory that had just stopped the massacres. Turkey was fighting several wars at once in 1919 through 1922, including against Greece. So the worst part of the Greek deportations happened when the city of Smyrna was burnt and thousands died in the flames. After those wars ended, the Ottoman Empire was no more. Turkey controlled Western Armenia, whereas the country of Armenia would eventually be subsumed by the USSR. For Turkey, they began a policy called Turkification, which forced conversions to Islam, name changes, confiscation of empty Armenian property, and to this day punishes people for speaking ill of Turkey. You can go to jail for making jokes at Turkey's expense. Like, a Turk, a Greek, and an Armenian walk into a bar. Guess which one's coming out? Okay, I'll go to jail now. As a result, Western Armenians have basically hidden their ethnic background, and the diaspora of those who were displaced by these events continues. The atrocities visited upon the Greeks, Assyrians, and Armenians were the prime example given in 1943 for the creation of the word genocide.
Let's say they're modern cavalry out on orders of their commanders. They're huntsmen on the chase, only the prey doesn't happen to be a fox. The prey is people. These were the victims. They are Armenians, and the place is Asia Minor.
Dr. Raphael Lemkin, who is a professor of law at Yale University and specializing in teaching matters about the United Nations. Dr. Lemkin is the man who created the word genocide and really has fought this thing from long, long ago.
Later on, I became interested in genocide because it happened so many times. It happened to the Armenians and...
The Armenian genocide has thusly become a topic of hot debate. Turkey has instituted Armenian genocide denial and forced her allies to tiptoe around the subject.
What are you doing?
They're just Armenians.
But there is plenty of study into the subject, despite the blatant ignorance in the country itself.
Well, race genocide never taken away. All of our pride, genocide never taken away.
The Armenian genocide is the most studied genocide in history after the Holocaust during World War II. In many ways, it was the precursor for that. Even though the Armenian genocide does seem to get forgotten by the mainstream, it is by no means lacking representation in literature. One could read 100 books on the subject and still cover less than half of the total literature. Because of the official denial by Turkey, study has been made difficult, but scholars are endlessly resourceful folk when it comes to research. There is plenty of easily available material, and I've only scratched the surface of this subject in this episode. Perhaps the most contested part of the scholarship is the number of dead, but it seems safe to say the number is above 1 million with another million Greeks and Assyrians. So this movie has a lot to use for sourcing, and there isn't a lot of room for blank filling. So instead, they fictionalize the main characters, which allows them to turn this into your typical love triangle disaster flick. Instead of focusing on that vapid storyline, they choose to use it as a device to travel through the process of this genocide in a kind of hero's journey. Although the end of the movie is clearly based on the 1933 novel The 40 Days of Musa Dagh. This movie is intended to bring people to this subject. Kirk Kerkorian, the producer of this film, and previously featured on this channel in the Las Vegas episode, is of Armenian descent, so he is trying to draw attention to a very important subject for him. He literally paid for this out of pocket, all $90 million of it. As a result of his philanthropic motives in making this movie, the profits are being donated to charitable and human rights foundations. Unfortunately, it only made $10 million at the box office, but hopefully it will make more in the long run. I've never even heard of a movie doing something like this, so this is quite admirable. Of course, since this is a touchy subject, the movie has been brigaded. On IMDb, before the movie was released, there was over 86,000 ratings of it, 55,000 of which were 1 stars. There seems to have been a coordinated attack by genocide deniers to hurt this film. These butthurt ignoramuses might even brigade this review. Yeah, there's no way I'm going to be able to keep monetization on this one. And Google hides with its tail between its legs when it comes to history that is challenging. So, Patreon! And if they do demonetize this, that clearly shows that Google supports genocide denialists. Notably, since this movie is actually quite accurate. Since the movie uses the typical hero's journey narrative to hit certain events, rather than trying to explore historical characters themselves, it is pretty dang good. It's very culturally aware of the time frame, so it doesn't try to demonize all Turks,
is that no one's to be spared. You should evacuate the orphans as soon as you can.
or make them out to be completely unable to live together.
The Armenians are a tumor in our midst.
It starts calm with the protagonist in his peaceful village, begins the genocide with Red Sunday, moves through the labor battalions, and then he escapes and sees the full scale of the genocide. Eventually they end up in a resistance fight. It's a hero's journey through genocide, all of which is true to life. There's also the other two main characters, an American reporter and an Armenian dance instructor. So the movie uses these two to explore other parts of the genocide, mainly how it was reported and a woman's perspective. This is altogether effective. I especially like the part where the journalist is captured and suspected of spying. When the US ambassador meets with one of the three pashas, Talat Pasha asks for a list of life insurance policies so that Cup can collect on the people they are killing.
I wish you would get these American life insurance companies to send us a complete list of Armenian policyholders. They're practically all dead now, and they have left no heirs to collect the money. The government is the beneficiary now.
You will never get any such list from me.
This surprising scene is actually true. Now, a lot of people have complained how formulaic this movie is, and oh geez, another love triangle. Ugh. But this is not the main feature of the film. I'm not really a good judge of love stories, so I won't tell you if it's too vapid, but I will say the way that it interweaves the film's depiction of the genocide is kind of brilliant. Unlike Titanic or the other one, go to your corner bay and think about what you've done. This movie, on the other hand, uses its love triangle to improve the narrative, not detract from it. Also, and this is a huge spoiler of the fictional plot, so you've been warned, it kills off the woman rather than one of the men. Now that is usurping a trope. All in all, this movie is wonderful, and you should go see it. I do have one minor complaint with its accuracy though. I found one major inaccuracy in this while I was going through the editing process, so I'm adding this as a bit of an addendum, I guess. It shows the deportations happening before Red Sunday, which obviously those two should be flipped. It would seem like a minor slip, except for some of the plot does revolve around that key turn, which is false, and the fictionalization doesn't allow for this particular inaccuracy. By showing this in the wrong order, they're making the Turks seem like they were just constantly doing this throughout their entire reign, and obviously that is incorrect. But since I didn't catch it while writing the script, this isn't really my main problem with the film. Instead, there's an omission to this that is pretty important to grasp. Much like in Hotel Rwanda, you don't really understand why these things are happening. They just happen. This movie is actually worse in that regard because Hotel Rwanda does do a meager attempt at explaining the situation. There is one throwaway line in this movie that hints at a deeper history of this.
Don't you see what's happened? We've lived through these Turkish threats before.
But we're never introduced to the ARF. We're not told about previous conflicts and Armenian nationalism, and we aren't even shown the Caucasus campaign and the growing distrust of Armenians because of Russian Armenians. Heck, we're not even shown some sort of event that explains the long-standing hatred in any way. Then it also fails to let us know the full extent of this and the ongoing problems. It just ends with the protagonist having a party in America. With this kind of fictionalization, they have a lot of leeway to show these things. They could have easily woven it into the plot. If you're going to introduce people to this genocide, it is important to help them understand it. Hopefully this episode goes a long way to fixing that. But that is a problem by omission. It is not directly inaccurate and so deserves to be praised. I know a few people who weren't aware of the Armenian genocide before the film, so it is doing its job. I just hope that more people will come to understand the genocide better, rather than simply know that it happened. In Susan, that's in France, was burnt and just bit my tongue, ow.
Ervitse galis,